Well, because there is, of course, a bit of a war going on, there's also a humanitarian crisis emerging out of it. There's been a mass exodus of civilians who have either fled to save their lives, obviously in fear, or have had their homes completely obliterated, so they have no choice, nowhere to go, and need help. Most of these refugees are women, children, and men over 60 who are not of fighting age because, of course, they issued the conscript, didn't they, quite early.
You can certainly say that a lot of the footage of the Ukrainian refugees is very stark from the so-called refugees that you find in Calais or the US border.
It's rather suspicious. And I don't want to get into the business too much of beating people while they're down, you could say, but it is when you actually look at some of the people claiming to be refugees in Ukraine, when we of course have knowledge of the demographics of Ukraine as a country, you have to question, who's actually coming in and how easy is it for people who perhaps aren't Ukrainians to actually penetrate the border.
Well, it was only this morning that the Telegraph published an article of this so-called Ukrainian family that looked distinctly Middle Eastern. I don't know.
Yeah, but there has been continuous pressure on Boris Johnson pretty much from the start, from within and outside Parliament, to offer Ukrainian refugees, whether they're actually Ukrainian or not, temporary residence. And this has been pretty much ongoing since the beginning of the war. But finally, an official policy has been announced. It has been called, as you can guess from the title, the Homes for Ukraine scheme, and it was unveiled on Monday by Michael Gove. The details are quite interesting. So, Homes for Ukraine. If we move on to the tweet here, so Homes for Ukraine will be open to all Ukrainian nationals, and as you can see from the tweet, there'll be no cap, or maybe not the tweet, but there will be no cap on numbers, and all taken in will be able to live and work in the United Kingdom for up to 3 years. All refugees will have full and unrestricted access to benefits, healthcare, employment, and other support, and those who decide to take them in will have to provide accommodation for at least 6 months. But there is a financial incentive involved, as the BBC have illustrated here. Sponsors who participate in the Homes for Ukraine programme will receive £350 per month for their trouble, which will be tax-free and will not affect benefits, entitlements, or their council tax status. And if you scroll down ever so slightly, the local authorities are also going to be offered £10,500 in extra funding per refugee for support services, with more for children of school age. This is what the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities has said. Under the new scheme, sponsors in the UK will not be required to know the refugees in advance, and there will be no limit on numbers. Ukrainians on the scheme will be given leave to remain for 3 years, with the right to work and access public services. Mr Gove told the BBC that he anticipated tens of thousands of Ukrainians might be taken in by UK families to the first arrivals within a week. Applications will be made online, with both sponsors being vetted and refugees having to go through security checks. The sponsor will get a thank you payment of £350 a month. Thoughts?
So there's lots of interesting things going on here. So did you say that it was 3 years that they're going to be housed here?
Yep, 3 years.
So at least there's potential for them to actually go back home once this conflict has ended. If it has ended in 3 years' time, who knows? But also they're going to effectively be citizens for that potential 3 years, and there's an unlimited cap. So sure, I mean, at least they are legitimate refugees for once.
Yeah, they are legitimate refugees, the overwhelming majority, of course. And I fully understand the moral case. But this sounds extremely expensive, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I don't really understand how the people who are actually going out of their way to house them are getting £350, which, sure, financial incentive, whatever, if the government wants to do that. I'm not happy that they're reallocating taxpayers' money, but the £10,000 for local councils, that seems wildly disproportionate to what people are being compensated for housing them in the first place.
Yeah. You know what might have been more effective? If they just abolished council tax for those who actually take them in. That might actually end up making this a bit more rewarding for those.
I would take in loads of refugees if that were the case.
Yeah. But it's estimated that 2 million people have fled Ukraine so far. Michael Gove anticipated there were going to be tens of thousands coming, but how many of that 2 million do you think may actually end up in the UK? Whatever the number, offering that same number unrestricted access to benefits and public services is going to be hugely expensive. And as I said, can we actually afford it?
Well, it's on top of, inflation rates being close to double digits at this point for this year, and after we've sabotaged our economy because of all the lockdowns and things like that. nature. It's not exactly the best time for us to be footing the bill for lots of other people, although I certainly understand why people would want to flee a war
course.
zone, an actual proper reason
Yeah.
to be a refugee.
Yeah, but this is what refugees ultimately. This is what the normal definition of a refugee has always been before we started bending over backwards to accommodate for anyone who just wants to come to the UK.
Oh yeah, we
like
had
economic migrants, basically.
like all the people in Calais, like Iranian and North African, where there are no wars going on, obviously.
Yeah, but interestingly, despite the fact that the attractiveness to this scheme is arguably questionable depending which way you look at it, it's actually been very successful so far, because by the evening that Michael Gove had actually made this announcement, 44,000 people had signed up to it.
That's
44,000.
So that's going to be ridiculously expensive then.
Yes.
Because is that £10,000 per local council per person?
Yeah.
So out of this 44,000, they could also sign up to house more than one person as well.
Bear in mind that this was on Monday. It's gone up since then. If we move on to the next tweet, it's now 100,000 UK houses which have signed up to host a Ukrainian refugee.
So this is as if we haven't done enough to bankrupt our country. Great.
Yeah. I mean, it's admirable, but you do, as a taxpayer, have to wonder whether this is going to come back to bite us, especially given that we haven't seen the full extent of the economic sanctions we've imposed on Russia yet. And of course, the sanctions they are going to impose on us.
Yeah, our economy is going to be basically in tatters, and we're going to have a large influx in people, apparently.
Yeah.
More so than even normal. I mean, the growth rate is already ridiculous from abroad.
It is. So these are all perfectly, I suppose, rational, maybe slightly cynical responses to those who have a very, very open heart, and as they should do. It's something that any moral person would want to do, of course, to help those in need.
It is kind of nice to see that a lot of the people who would otherwise be virtue signaling on Twitter actually doing something tangible.
Well, yes, precisely. As in acting on virtue rather than just saying they're going to do it,
exactly.
but not actually acting. Some, however, haven't been as rational and have actually rather taken issue with the generosity of the British people. Why do you think this is, just out of interest?
Is it racist? Is it because it's a bunch of white people?
It's because it's racist. And
Of
you can
course.
probably guess where this is going. The one person who's taken issue with this policy, again, can't say I've ever heard of him, is Dr. Ayo Sogunro, a corporate finance lawyer turned human rights activist.
That's always a good match
Yes.
for reasonable takes on politics.
Indeed, but he has said this. Can't get it out of my head that Europe cried about a migrants crisis in 2015 against 1.4 million refugees fleeing war in Syria, and yet quickly absorbed some 2 million Ukrainians within days, complete with flags and piano music. Europe never had a migrants crisis, it has a racism crisis.
Well, there is, of course, the obvious point that Ukraine is a lot closer to Britain than Syria is.
Yes, and perhaps culturally closer as well. So there's not going to be the looming fear of, cultural disparities that could lead to, social tension, perhaps.
Terrorist attacks.
And then there is, of course, the fact that Islamic State themselves said in 2015 they were going to exploit the Schengen policy to actually spread potential or coordinate terrorist attacks across Europe. So there is that, of course.
I mean, there were
that's
people
not
who
racist,
were
is it?
so-called refugees, weren't there, that actually did go on to carry out terrorist attacks. So it wasn't just like they just, banded it around. They actually followed through with what they said.
Yes. But sadly, Dr. Ayo Sogunro is not the only person who has taken issue with this. Another is Dr. Shola Mos Shogbamimu, who has said government paying Brits £350 a month to house Ukrainian refugees was never on offer for refugees fleeing wars, persecution, danger in Africa, Asia and Middle East. Instead, boats are turned, people deported. Disparity in refugee treatment is because Ukrainians are white and European. One of them.
Well, if we had this policy for Africa, then we would be taking in the entire continent of Africa at some point.
Yeah. So the point here is, why not just give £350 for anyone to take any refugee anywhere around the world? Can you imagine any problems at all with making this policy
It's so
actually legislating for this?
such dumb whataboutism, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Well, for a start, again, as we've already said, it would cost the country an absolute fortune. Most ordinary people wouldn't be able to foot that bill, even if they are given £350. Some businesses could use the policy as a clever way of getting cheap labour, perhaps, as has happened.
Wait, how could they do that?
How could they do that? Well, didn't this happen with was it boohoo.com?
Oh yeah, I remember hearing about that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so it happened there. I'm not entirely sure on the exact details, but they were asylum seekers basically working for what was ultimately below minimum wage. So they could in
great.
theory offer residence, depending on, I suppose, the red tape or the lack thereof, to actually offer them residence, perhaps coincidentally the area that they'd be working, and then say, I'll tell you what, why don't you go on this sewing machine for 8 hours a day, just to keep yourself occupied. Yeah, and I'll give this 350 pounds to you as a thank you payment at the end of the month.
There's going to be some kind of incentive for basically pseudo slave labour.
Again, maybe I am being slightly cynical, but you could offer a financial incentive for people to accommodate those. Again, this is probably the most obvious one in the case of taking refugees from the Middle East. You could be accommodating those who are potential terrorists.
Yes.
If what Islamic State said is ultimately true. But to my knowledge, neither of the two aforementioned race baiters are taking refugees either. If they are, then please let me know. But unsurprisingly, they're not the only ones not to do so. Boris Johnson's not going to be taking any in either. He's ruled himself out for security reasons. And to be fair, it probably isn't the best idea to be hosting refugees if you live at number 10. I mean, could you imagine seeing them walk in after like a noisy night out? Like, it could be quite awkward. I mean, they are after all fellow members of the first world.
To be fair, if it's number 10 Downing Street, Boris is only going to be sore about not being invited to the party.
You are absolutely right. It would be perfectly in keeping with the culture at number 10. Perhaps it would almost turn into a scene from the thick of it. But another person who's ruled himself out, funny enough, I don't have a link for this, but it's Sadiq Khan. Yes. Yeah, apparently he didn't think it was appropriate for him to incorporate refugees into his family home, probably like many families across Britain. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has apparently forged an application, which is interesting. And Michael Gove is also allegedly thinking about it. However...
He's announced that he's thinking about it.
But
what a useful announcement.
Exactly. Well, one man has decided to be decisive. A former health secretary. Can you guess who?
Is it, by any chance, Matt Hancock?
It is Matt Hancock.
His gormless face on the screen.
It is Matt Hancock, who has agreed to house as many as 5.
Well, he probably wants to trade in his Italian squeeze for 5 lovely Ukrainian ladies, because he's heard that, it's all women that are going to be these refugees. And we know his attitude towards being faithful to women.
Yes, it's somewhat lacking, isn't it? Is he single at the moment?
I don't know. I don't keep track of what Matt Hancock's dating life is like.
No, neither do I. This tends to be in the back pages of the Daily Star, doesn't it? But I would assume this would be kind of right up his street if he is that way inclined, as you say. But anyway, the West Southwark MP posted on Twitter saying that he had signed up to the government scheme and urged his constituents to do the same. He said that he'd be hosting refugees because we must stand with Ukraine. Speaking to ITV's Good Morning Britain on Tuesday, he revealed that he had already been in contact with one of his British Ukrainian constituents before the scheme was launched, and is hoping to host a family of 5.
So it is.
Yes,
a family at least.
It is a family. Something. It is a family at least. So I suppose kudos to Matt Hancock.
So it's not going to be like a sitcom scenario where Matt Hancock with 5 beautiful young Ukrainian women.
No. Is it wrong that a part of me is disappointed, because that would be quite?
No, I think keeping young women away from Matt Hancock is probably a good public service.
That part of it, but I guess I'm just thinking about the entertaining side of the spectacle. But again, that perhaps I should retire my cynicism. Anyway, I want to move on from Matt Hancock to make a more general point, because on the face of it, it of course seems mean-spirited to put people down for being willing to come to the aid of those who are genuinely fleeing from such circumstances. But there's another side to this which isn't being discussed, which could be called hypocrisy. There have been some people in need, many people in need, in the United Kingdom before this crisis emerged. I'm not talking about other refugees. I'm talking about our own citizens in this country who have, for example, served in the military but have ended up on the streets nonetheless, fighting for our freedom in, Iraq, Afghanistan, only to find completely devoid of any help from anyone. Where were the financial incentives to help them?
Yeah, well, it seems like we have a different standard for helping people from beyond our borders.
It does, doesn't it?
Than helping people in our own borders. And I think that this is something that has consumed the Anglosphere, this kind of weird self-loathing that we seem to have in abundance. seems to make us hate our own people and wish them ill, whilst glorifying those from outside, even though many times they're the ones that are out to harm us.
Well, yeah, I mean, the serious question is, do they deserve it more or less than the Ukrainian refugees? I mean, my God, that is a terrible thing to have to ask. But really, you have to ask the question.
Well, I suppose...
why haven't the politicians been calling for this? I know that some have been for a very, very long time. Where has the urgency been to help them when they're arguably suffering from the same levels of psychological trauma?
Yeah, I don't doubt it, especially if they were fighting on say, the front lines, then they've probably seen more combat than the actual refugees. However, I understand that it's only a temporary thing, and it's certainly not their fault to want to flee a war zone. If I weren't fighting, I would want to do the same.
But in short, this is the point that Jim Davidson made on GB News as a response to celebrities claiming that they'd be willing to house refugees. It was aimed particularly at Benedict Cumberbatch. I'm not sure if you recall, but the BAFTA Awards happened very, very recently. He was there speaking on the red carpet, as they do. And he announced that he hoped to be a part of the effort to provide homes for the victims. This is what he said in particular. We need to donate. We need to pressure our politicians to create some kind of refuge, safety, and a haven here for people who are suffering. Everyone needs to do this as much as they can. And I think already today the news has broken that there's been a record number of people volunteering to take people into their homes, and indeed there has, as we've seen. I hope to be a part of that myself. Those were his words.
It's all well and good for people with lots of money to be able to call for this kind of stuff, but there are people who are actually struggling to get by. An influx of people and increases in public spending, that's not going to necessarily help them, especially with the cost of living going the way it's going.
But shall we hear what Jim Davidson said himself?
Sure.
Let's do it.
What do you make of it when they take over these ceremonies to politically pontificate?
Well, it's what people do. It's their chance to get on the soapbox. Ask him if he'll take in a veteran that's homeless, that's fought in many wars for our country. No, that's not lefty enough. I mean, I don't mind all these guys. They're all lefties. They all get together and sit round, do the Guardian crossword, but they're not in the real world. And this girl, is she funny? Then I'm in the wrong job. Jonathan Shalit will probably tell me that anyway.
Talking about Rebel Wilson there, who I only heard about, what was it, last night? So
He's right that she's not funny, I'll give him that.
No, she's not funny in the slightest. But he is right in saying that the very reason that there is this huge weight or desire to jump on the bandwagon of this cause is because it kind of it's more lefty than it would be to take in someone who's suffering from the same thing at home. But that's not fundamentally wrong, is it?
Well, it's seen as sort of jingoistic and nationalistic, isn't it, to help people in your own country now for some reason, whereas helping others from abroad, you almost have no vested interest to do that, or at least that's the way they present it. And therefore it's seen as more virtuous when in reality, I imagine, sure, there's some virtue in helping anyone, really. But
the actual lack of virtue is exposed in the fact that the second that there's a cause that is being kind of more socially recognised, they jump to that and jump to the aid of those people who, again, deserve help. But there is an element of performativity there. They're thinking about how the rest of the world sees them, and it's a dreadful shame that they don't act from true virtuous volition and apply that policy, given how much money they actually have, to those who are as in need as they are. But I'm going to conclude here. I respect any ordinary person for taking someone in at this point, but it is a flawed government policy, and I don't really know if I like the guilt tripping all that much. It's not only unfair to those who have served the country, it's a bit of an insult to them. It's going to be a very expensive one for the taxpayer in general. Many people are almost certainly not in a position to make these commitments, but that does nonetheless effectively sum up the government's economic position at the moment. Really, spend now and think about it later.
If you appreciate that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as this premium hangout that Josh and Thomas did together, this one on should capitalism be restricted because can free markets and morality coexist? If you want to follow Thomas, you can also follow him at Getter at Thomas Dowling on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.